Reactive training systems.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS Podcast. Today I've got a special guest, Isabella von Weissenberg, and we get to talk about a lot of cool stuff during this podcast. It's a lot different than our usual fare. Talking with Isabella, we pretty much stay away from topics concerning exercises, sets and reps, and we focus really almost exclusively on the mental side of training and competing, how to deal with different pressures and things like that, which I think is important and something that doesn't get talked about all that much. I mentioned during the podcast that, if you set a bunch of coaches down and had them rate, how important these different factors are to the success of the athlete, that mental training would always rank near the top, or your ability to handle mental stress would always rank near the top. But it's something that doesn't get focused on, doesn't get talked about, doesn't get addressed directly very much. But we definitely address it today in this podcast. We talk about Isabella and her use of aggression in training, or apparent aggression. And we talk about her just artistic expression and how that comes through in lifting. Things like handling negative emotions, different strategies for how to do that, being really open about what that brings, the emotional journey of lifting, and what that means, and what being open about it means, and how to set some personal boundaries, and how to deal with criticisms and things like that, things that a lot of lifters nowadays face, even more so than they did back in my day. So it's something that comes up more and more all the time. We also get to discuss how the approach of a major competition affects mental performance, and some different coping strategies that get employed as she moves closer to competition. And we also talk about emerging strategies. We talk about how the additional flexibility in training and the repeatability, the lack of just kind of shotgun variation that most training strategies would have, how that's not present in emerging strategies, and how that affects her from a mental performance standpoint, intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and so on. So I think I've introduced this podcast long enough. We definitely had a nice, rich conversation about all these topics. So I hope it's something that you enjoy, and we definitely get to talk about Isabella and her seminar circuit toward the end of the podcast. So if this type of conversation is interesting to you, then I definitely recommend that you check out the seminars that she's putting together. She's going to compete in Calgary in the 63 kilo weight class. So if you're available, then I definitely encourage you to watch that on the live stream, or watch that somehow, and make sure that you're cheering for Isabella. So with that, I'll bring you the podcast. When I first got started in this business as a whole, I would think about what kinds of things would I like, what type of information would I have wanted, when I was, an intermediate lifter, or, what kind of questions did I have? And, I kind of pursued it from that angle, but it's strange because that seems to take you so far, but then the sport as a whole has grown so much, and there's such a more diverse type of person that's interested in powerlifting and strength sports nowadays. That's not at all representative of powerlifting, so it's just funny how things have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started lifting, I heard of Kimberly Wolford. Someone showed me a YouTube clip of her, and I was like, wow, that's incredible. And I think it took me a year or two before I even heard of, the rest of the top female athletes.
Yeah.
And there definitely weren't anyone posting their training. And that's only like 2014, 2013, so not that long ago.
Yeah.
And now we have all this information from people, like from the inside of the lifting side, on a very high level.
That's true. Yeah. Just people are powerlifters in general are very open about what they do and how all of it works.
Yeah.
What they spend their time on and their energy on. I mean, that's interesting. It's immensely useful if you're willing to, parse through it and try to sort out what's good information and then what's just noise. But man, I don't know. I probably wouldn't have graduated from college if I had all that information. You know.
Oh my God, I'm so glad I did not have a smartphone when I was in high school, because I was struggling as it was.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's like, man, if I, you know, take the difficulties from before and compound them, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, as it was, there were some subjects, in particular when I was in college, I just barely got by in. They weren't very interesting to me, and I wasn't that good at applying myself to them. Not very talented in those subjects. I'm thinking like foreign languages and things like that. And like when I look back on it, it's like, yeah, I'm not very good at that. Like I'm not good at picking up things like that. But I would have been a lot better if I had stopped reading articles about powerlifting during class. Paid more attention. But yeah.
Well, who knows? What did you study in college?
I was a major in management.
Okay.
Yeah, it would have been business at any other school, but since it was a military school, I mean, kind of seems bad to have a military school and you major in business. So
Yeah.
we call it management, and it's generally the same thing.
Has that been useful for running RTS?
As far as like direct applicability, a little bit, but it's mostly things like my corporate accounting classes and stuff like that. Like that stuff has been directly useful. Early on, knowing how to do something like a feasibility study, which isn't really rocket science. Like if you would think through the problem rationally, you would figure it out. But having done things like that before, that's useful. But so one thing about the military school is that we had a really wide curriculum. So I was a management major and I had more classes in that subject, but I also had lots of engineering classes and classes in the sciences and foreign languages and all kinds of different things, philosophy and just different things.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think that I've used something that I've learned from pretty much all of those classes at this point, whether it's designing like my weight releasers that I have and videos and stuff I post.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like I designed those, and I mean it's not, you don't have to be like super engineering man to sketch up a picture of what you want and take it to a fabricator and he goes, yeah, I kind of get what you're getting at, but it helps, like
Yeah.
knowing something about angles and being able to do some basic trigonometry and stuff like that. It helps to get your ideas across, and that's what they wanted to accomplish with all that stuff anyway. So, it was useful.
I don't know if it's something you can translate, but in Sweden, there's Swedish. There's a saying that the burden of knowledge is weightless.
That's interesting. So,
like, well, the more you don't fill up space, you don't have to carry the weight of knowledge. You can always like carry more.
it's a good point. Like it's not a.
I wouldn't call it burden,
unlike,
but like the actual weight
yeah.
of knowledge isn't heavy on your shoulders.
No, that's a good point. Like, I mean, if you have a library full of books, that would be something that you would have to haul around, or you could just learn what's in the books, and then you don't have to carry them all,
Yeah.
right? Something like that.
Yeah, and like if you learn one language, it's going to be easier to learn a second, and like the more you understand it, easier it gets to gather more information.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we got the idea for you and I to have a conversation, do a podcast a couple weeks ago, when we started to have a conversation about mentality in training and just kind of how you approach it. So you're kind of more famous, I guess, for like getting really fired up in training. Like that's one of the things that you're known for. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what is it like for you? And like, has it changed over time, or just, I guess, really anything that you want to talk about in that regard?
Yeah, it has definitely changed over time. It has become more and more controlled, and I am in control of that intensity way better now. And it's very specific. I mean, I think I would just leak a lot of energy a few years back, and I don't feel like I do that anymore as much. But I know most people refer to it as like they think that I'm raging, and that is absolutely as far from the truth as you can come. It's a very, very unangry feeling in my lifting. I'm very. I've been thinking about it. I mean, I think about it all the time, and trying to define it for myself is difficult. But lately, I've come to terms with the word creativity. Like, I thought about this for a while, and when I grew up in a house. My father's an author, and my mom is an artist. And I always had like, from my entire upbringing, I had a very strong need to, how should I put it? I was raised to like be creative and think intellectually about things, and have a craft of some sort to express that has always been important to me. And when I was younger, this was way more like I used to draw and write and do things like that. But that never became like a satisfying outlet. I could never like get the actual feeling that I wanted out with that craft. And when I started lifting, this is something I've realized now, but I can really look back on it and see how this has become my craft. And it's my way of like getting that stuff out that I feel like I have to get out to feel creative and like express myself and approach life, approach my thoughts, and sharpen myself and sharpen my mental strategies in life. And all of that goes into the lifting. So it's the feeling isn't the aggression that you see is like something that is very strong in me, and I channel it on the bar.
That's really interesting to me. Like, I feel like I occupy some weird middle ground, I guess, where I can relate to the artistic expression a little bit, but my tendency is to try to explain everything with words rationally, and I think it fails pretty hard when it comes to trying to explain art. Like I don't think it is a rational expression in a lot of ways, but that is really cool, interesting, that it's kind of become this artistic expression.
Yeah.
Has it kind of fit that that niche, I guess, since the beginning, or is it more? Did it take some time to develop?
Well, the thing that I fell for in powerlifting, I think you know that I started training. I think it's about almost 5 years ago now, and I was completely untrained when I started. I had never done any sports before, and I was 23, late 23. So I just spent like a decade partying, basically. And I used to love going to clubs and dance. And I remember when I just felt like I had to put that behind me. It wasn't like, it was the feeling I was searching for, but it wasn't the constructive, creative thing that I was searching for. And I started lifting, and I felt like that physical sensation of expressing myself. And I was like, this is like dancing, but I'm using a barbell in a controlled movement.
Very cool, yeah.
Yeah. So that thought was very early. I felt that from the start. And then powerlifting is, I mean, you can be as intellectual as you want about it. There's a science to it, and there's a philosophy to it, and there's so much psychology behind it, and so many things that you can consider just from these three lifts. And like the more time I've spent with it, I feel like I'm coming to a certain point in my life where I can tie everything together, like career-wise, and ways to talk about things, and ways to connect with people, and just ways to grow as a person. All of this has come from how I've like developed myself as a person and a lifter over the past 5 years. So just I'm starting to understand it a little bit more, but it was very confusing at first.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe it's one of those things that we don't want to rush to conclusions about as well. That
Well,
like if it takes a while to figure it out, then that's okay. Like, it wouldn't be as fun if we had all the answers tomorrow. If
yeah,
it takes a little while to sort it all out, then I think that's okay.
yeah.
You know?
My first, I know, like you're very interested in the numbers, right?
Yeah, I tend to be more oriented that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm starting to get there. But my first like 2 years, I didn't want to hear about it because that was so uninteresting for me. And everybody was telling me like, you have to follow the program. I'm like, no, I'm busy searching for myself right now. Don't want to think about those numbers right now. So my first years of powerlifting was just searching for a certain attitude and a certain feeling. And I think I grew very strong in that, in myself, in that sense, that I focused so much on that. So now that I've actually come to understand more and more about like the actual biomechanics and the programming behind it, I feel like I can like level up a bit more now. But I definitely took my time to just focus on what was the most important for me at first.
Yeah. Well, I think there's nothing wrong with that. That I think we have a tendency in the sport to, I guess, make it all about the physical nature of it. That
Mm.
I think our tendency is to look at the body and say, okay, this is what you need in order to construct, the physical side of it. We want to construct larger muscles. We want to, tune the nervous system, and we look at it mechanistically like that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not a difference between the body, the physiology, and the mind, the psychology. Like there's not a clear line between them.
No.
The thing that really drove this home for me was when I was looking into this personality stuff, and I saw that different personality types have been correlated to different resting levels or sensitivities to certain neurotransmitters in the brain. And like that's fascinating, right? Because when we think of personality, we think of like this software program that's like running, it's like peripheral. It's not central to the whole, building the better powerlifting machine,
Mm.
but that one thing is like, it highlights like, no, there's a distinct connection. Like the personality, the software is the same thing. It comes from the physiology. Like they're inextricably connected.
Yeah.
And if you ignore any aspect of this system, then you're ignoring the person who's doing it. Like if you say, well, I know that you're like, take you when you're first doing this and you're not interested in the numbers, you're not interested in following a program, you just want to do what you want to do. Now we could say, well, that's not the best way because of this and this and this. Like, okay, yeah, from a muscular standpoint, from a nervous system standpoint, maybe that's true, but it's not really true. Like it's only true in the sense that if we were to isolate your mind from your body, and since that's not the reality that we're dealing with, like that's not helpful.
Yeah, and it's also cutting out a huge part of what makes a good lifter. Like for me, it was if someone would have given me a program and I would have followed it as a novice and trusted in that process, like the way you need to buy into something to like improve from it, I think that would have taken from the process and the journey I made to increase my autonomy and become like a very, very strong, get a very strong sense of self. And now that I have a very excellent program from a good coach, I still feel like this is all on my terms all the time. Yeah. So that in itself is making me stronger, just knowing that this is for me, everything.
Right.
I mean, I trust you 100%, but I still know that I have the control over what I do in the gym.
Exactly. That, that's one of the cool things I think about the situation that we're in with powerlifting is that, the athlete is the boss,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like if you were I don't know, a professional player in a variety of other sports, there's a sport organization hierarchy that gets kind of arranged. And I guess some powerlifters in some countries still kind of have that. But for the most part, the athlete is the boss. And I think that's a healthy way for it to be in the long term. And I mean, it probably leads to some situations that are not perfect, because the athlete can't be an expert in everything. No. But as long as there's a good working relationship there, I think that you're gonna, for the most part, get where you're trying to go. That I don't know. It to me, it goes back to the thing that we were touching on just a second ago. Like if you had a program that doesn't take into account, your own preferences, like what you want to do, it's not just a matter of adherence to the program. Like I think that's true as well, that adherence comes into play there. But like what you're saying, that being able to do things your way contributes to your mental development as well, like your development and maturity as an athlete. And it's one of those things where, you put a bunch of coaches in the room and you throw this question in the middle and you say, how important is the mental side of competing? How important is the mental side of training in strength sports? And all the coaches, they nod at each other and they go, yeah. Mental, like having being a strong mental game is critical. It's important, but then when it comes time to write programs, nobody acknowledges it. We kind of forget all about it, pretend it doesn't exist. Like what's that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Or act, I suppose they sometimes we act like everybody's mental game is developed the same way, which is just another way around it, getting at the same thing,
Yeah. Oh, we were. By the way, I listened to the podcast you did with Julian.
Oh yeah.
And that was interesting because I got off a call with him like the day before.
Really?
That came out, yeah. And he said something, and I said, I'm going to quote you on that. And he said, I would rather fail my way than succeed yours. and it's just struck me as very interesting and
Yeah.
very I resonated with it. That is such a huge part for how I want to learn and how I want to grow, is just try things and see what happens. And no matter what, I told someone this morning, sounds a bit like I'm on a high horse, but I said, I don't do anything wrong ever. Because no matter what I do, like if I fail or if I win, I just learn from it and I grow from it. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter, but you get my point. Like
Of course.
I gather things from everything, and all my mistakes are wins in that sense. So
Yeah.
looking back on those first years of like cowboy training, I can see all the wins that I did, and I'm really thankful for it.
I love that you call that cowboy training. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
No, I can relate to that a lot. That it's like I've never had a coach, like someone writing my own programming in powerlifting. I've always done it myself. Uh, so so I started lifting weights in like '97, doing my own thing. And then when I got into an organized sport in high school, it was like the second workout. I came in and was like, "Hey, coach, I wrote my own program," you know. And thankfully, he kind of let it go. You know, I don't know if he, explicitly understood, but he obviously implicitly understood that, uh, here's this kid who's enthusiastic about lifting weights, which is what I really want him to do anyway. So whatever, kid, go nuts,
Yeah.
And he didn't squash that enthusiasm. And, I'm very grateful for that now. Yeah, I've still got those programs around here somewhere. I should get those and publish them because they're
That would have been
terrible.
interesting to
Yeah,
see.
but it's some of the stuff like you learn. It's exactly what you're saying. It's some of the stuff that you learn in those early times. Like, yeah, okay, even though, well, you could have been practicing the competition lifts in this way or that way. Like, well, I was learning things that I may, even now, 20 years later, may not be able to explicitly express, that it's an important part of development. Now, that's not the way for everybody, like not everybody's as hard-headed as I am, but I think that if you're inclined that way, that you shouldn't be made to feel like, you're not taking your sport seriously or that you're doing yourself a disservice or something like that. Like it's a different path,
Yeah. And I think it's just, as long as you're mindful of like always reflecting on what you're doing, like it's the difference. I wasn't doing mindless training. I was doing my type of training and my type of approach. So I've always been reflecting about why am I doing like this? Why am I reacting like this to that thing I just did? And how can I improve to my next session and be more and more focused in that second that I need to be focused in? And like, I've always put 100% effort into it. And maybe that wasn't like number-wise the most strategic way to go about it, but it definitely was like the best mental training I think I could have gotten at that point.
Well, maybe that's a good connection between our two stories there, is that like you strike me as a introspective person. When we were talking about, how you've approached it mentally in the beginning, and you said that you've been thinking about it a long time, and you're coming to think of it as something like creativity. The fact that you've been thinking about it for a long time, I think says something, and maybe that's the thing that you've got to have. You've got to have this willingness to, to sit with some of these ideas and just kind of let them soak in and marinate for a long time before you can figure out what the answer is, that it's not going to be a thing that you figure out in 5 minutes,
Yeah.
I don't know. Is this at all a formal process for you? Like, do you write or, I mean, you mentioned some other, I guess, artistic pursuits that you've had earlier in life. Do you continue to do much of that?
Yeah, I was actually going over my notes from a few years back like a training journal, but more of a emotional training journal.
Yeah.
And it struck me that I do a lot of the things the same, but the biggest difference now is how I view myself and my capacity. Like I was very, very, do you say tentative? Hesitant to make statements, and I was very afraid of speaking out about anything because I didn't want. There's so much authority in the world of sports, and I just sort of blundered in there and like, hey, here am I? I'm here. I'm doing my thing here now, and reading these notes, I'm really questioning myself whether or not I'm right, and I think that's kind of sweet because I can see now that I was right. So yeah, I've grown in my confidence.
Yeah.
And not so much in like the lifting confidence was always there from the start, but I've grown in I've accepted my way of thinking about it, and I've accepted my approach, and I feel very like proud of having developed that by myself.
Is there any more, like, can you think of a more concrete example of how that went? Like how that's changed for you over time, or how you've developed from earlier in your competitive career to now?
Can you be slightly more specific?
Well, just thinking about like you're more confident, you're more sure of yourself, but not necessarily. It's not a question of confidence like as you're approaching the barbell. I don't think it's more. I think what you mean is like being a participant in the sport outside of that context. Is
Mm-hmm.
is that right?
Yeah.
So, does anything come to mind as far as an example of where you were less confident before, and now you're like, well, yeah, I know the so-called experts say X, but for me, it's Y.
Yeah. So I have a lot to say about that. Where to start? So first off, I would say handling anxiety and negative emotions. So most people would just say like you're gonna have to be more think like positive about the meets and like I should explain it. I've always had a feeling that I can't shake this off, this feeling of anxiety that I get sometimes. And what I did is just I started to look at it more closely and realized that the one thing that helps for me to get rid of it is to look at it and accept it and talk about it and verbalize it. So when I initially started competing, I got like huge amounts of performance anxiety, and I was just basically told that you're gonna learn to like it. And I think what I did was to not learn to like it, but learn to handle how to have anxiety about it. That was one thing. The other was, I think I would say, exercise selection and training frequency. The amount of training that I did and the amount of rest days that I had initially. I was training at a very, very high intensity, like every session. And I think that was one thing that I could have done differently and was told to do differently, definitely. And I just decided that I would keep doing what I was doing and learn more about how to execute the extremely heavy lifts with the approach that I had back then, and focus on that. And it got me pretty far for a very long time.
Yeah.
There's a few aspects, and there's more, of course, but
well, the anxiety thing is really interesting because it's a thing that a lot of people deal with. I guess everyone to some extent, you know, because if you're in a room full of powerlifters and you talk about that feeling that you get before your opening squat, everybody's head nods, you know, like everybody knows that feeling, but uh, it's different. It's different in magnitude. It's different in how it feels to different people, because some people feel that and it is a positive thing. You know, it helps them perform better. Then you have other people like me who it's easy for that feeling to start feeling uncontrolled.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy for it to start feeling like scattered, or overwhelming sounds like over dramatizing it for me, but it's something like that. And I know that for some other people who maybe are a bit higher in trait neuroticism or something like that, that's probably a very accurate way to say it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's interesting that the way to deal with that is, I guess, what am I trying to say here? I guess what I'm saying is, like, when we talk about stuff like anxiety for
Mm-hmm.
lifting, a lot of what you get is like pop psychology type things, you know. You'll have kind of these one size fits all answers, you know, that, you know, well, you have to think positively, or you have to embrace your haters, or whatever, you know, phrase of the moment seems to be catching on, but it's not that, you know,
Yeah.
that it's more complicated than that. You know, I had a friend, I can't remember if I've told this story on the podcast before or not, but I'll tell it again. I had a friend who was very sick. He had some illnesses that were, you know, like 99.9% going to be terminal.
Mm-hmm.
He competed in strongman, and he had some friends of his that were in a similar situation. And uh, you know, I was talking with him about some of the word choice that they would use when they're talking to each other, you know, and they kind of had um, like kind of a self-deprecating style of communicating about this stuff. And, you know, I was, me being a know-it-all coach, I guess, was like, well, you should really speak more positively, and you should frame this you shouldn't be so negative about how, you know, your self-talk and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And he was like, look, you know, I know that that's what they say, but this is how we do it, and it's better. You know,
Yeah.
it's better if I approach it this way. And then it's like, well, at some point you have to listen to the person that's having the experience. You know,
Yeah.
there's a bunch of different ways to handle it. So anyway, long way around to getting back to the story that you told. It sounds like your approach to it has been to, um, I guess, communicate about it and be open about it, but I'm sure there's more to it than just that, right?
Yeah. And I think was coming into the sport as such a huge talent that I know that I was. I mean, I am. I have to be humble about that. But so there was all these expectations, and part of communicating this that we are talking about was also a way for me to set boundaries. Because being an athlete means that people are watching. It means that this is a game to a lot of people. Like what athletes accomplish is, in the eyes of some people, it's just like watching sports, you know. And it can be pretty difficult, especially when you're completely new to something, and such a huge, tremendous experience that lifting was and still is for me. So, like, people would tell me when I was going to my first Worlds, like, okay, so make sure you bring home a medal now. And I'm like, man, I want to die. Don't talk to me like that. So at first, like my first year, I know you and I talked about this before, that I was pushing myself so hard. Like every session I was going 100% all the time, like in and out of the gym, just focusing dedicating my life and every aspect of it to becoming like an athlete, because this was I was never that before. I wanted to be at 100% from the start, and taking in everybody else's input about what I was supposed to be able to do and accomplish with my body and my capacity was overwhelming. And I think it took me a year and a half or two before I just told someone, like, please don't talk to me like that ever again. Like, I don't need to hear that. And it is difficult to tell a friend, like someone that you like and want to have a relationship with, that you need to back off and let me do this my way and in my tempo, take my time to get to the point where I want to get to. And please accept that I am actually not going to Worlds to try and win something. I'm going there to just try and like get into this new life that I'm suddenly living and expose myself to experience like that. I talk about this a lot when I have like seminars and stuff. Like that first year of getting on the national team, 2015, was really difficult. Getting selected after a year and a half to go to Worlds was like, what? It was overwhelming, to say the least. And learning how to set those boundaries and tell people what their expectations, how uninteresting and unimportant they were for me, was a very big deal to be able to do.
So you mentioned boundaries. How sorry, my daughter's going to cry in the background for a second, but
it's okay.
You mentioned boundaries. So how has that been? Like, what kind of boundaries? Yeah, I guess just can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, so like
I suppose maybe that's what you were getting at with the expectations. Is there anything? Has it been more than just expectations, other people's expectations of your own achievement, I guess?
It's not so much towards other people, because most people are genuinely kind and care about you, but more to set boundaries within myself, to remind myself of why I'm doing what I'm doing and how little it has to do with performing for others. And you're at, I suppose, for not just at this level, probably for everybody, but that is surprisingly difficult to keep track of, like the actual point behind doing all of this and just becoming more secure in that.
Well, I think
I'm being very vague, I think.
It's okay. This is a hard topic, I think, to be specific about. But
I'm also talking about like something that is slightly more history now. So I'm almost referring to an old version of me. So it's not so much anymore.
Yeah. But I think that's a version that's you're speaking about a journey that a lot of people are on, and that you've been able to navigate, and that you can probably say something about how at least some of them might want to navigate their own journey. So I think that's a valid way to look at things and a valid way to proceed,
Yeah, I think, no matter what you're dedicating your life to, the outside expectations are always going to be a difficult factor to handle. And I really like the thing you posted something on your Facebook about the quest versus performance narrative.
Yeah.
And that was like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah. That was I shared a post from Steve Magnus, who has been. He's a really talented writer. He comes more from a running background, but I've found that a lot of the things that he has to say about training are very applicable to strength sports as well. There's a lot of crossover, and it might just be high-level athletics in general, but just high-level athletics is probably not the best way to describe that, because it's not so much the absolute level of your achievement, but just the fact that you're taking a craft and seeing how far you can go. You take it to its conclusion, and for some people that's high level, and for other people that's high level for them, and that's fine. That's kind of the reality that we're dealing with, and it's not that different in terms of the journey itself. There are aspects of it that are different. There's aspects of it that are intensified. Like it brings up another question I wanted to ask you. Actually, we're talking about boundaries and dealing with expectations and things like that. You're also very active and open on social media.
Yeah.
How has that affected your life or your lifting? Do you have to have any special boundaries in place to deal with that?
Yeah. Definitely. So that is something I'm trying to balance, because partly I really want to be part of that, that people are able to get an insight into what lifting is like. And this is funny because I talked about this as well earlier this morning on a different podcast in Swedish, but comes back to my own relationship to sports, that I didn't have any when I started, because for me sports was a realm of something that I didn't belong to. I didn't have access to it. I didn't feel like that was not for me. How was I supposed to start with sports? What is that even? I don't know. So that was something that the fit girls in my school did. I didn't have anything to do with sports, and I didn't have any information about what that could mean for me, other than in my 20s I would start to run to get skinnier, which is like, that's not sports. So for me, I just want to be a part of making sports more available for people who doesn't have that natural access that some people get from childhood and like upbringing and in school. So this is something I feel like I want to contribute with, and also like normalizing feelings in general, like difficult feelings, talking about them and making sure that I at least can be honest and open about what I feel, so that others feel like it's less stigma around it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we're all human and we all have them, but still we have such a difficulty talking about them. It's interesting. So that's like my quest, and that's my reason for being so transparent. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it is difficult when you write something that you feel negative about, or positive, whatever, but people give their opinion about it, and it's cool, but it's like when you say something that I feel like this, and someone doesn't validate you, that's always going to be difficult, like, because it's my feeling, I can't change it. Right. You can't tell me I feel like that. So I have all this input from thousands of people about my inner thoughts and feelings, and that is difficult. It's for me to be healthy and happy, I have to know how to shut that off and just like accept that people don't know me, and people don't have the authority over what I'm supposed to feel and think ever.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting, and I'm sure that, well, obviously I'm not the first one to, go on a bit philosophically about social media and its effects on whatever, but I would think that leads to some interesting adaptations in its own right, in terms of like adaptations of your psyche and adaptations of your own, I guess, mental approaches to training or life,
Mm-hmm.
Just that. So we've talked about being introspective. I've noticed that some of the things that someone will make a post or something, and very occasionally, I have a comment to make. And sometimes that comment is off. It's not, it's one of the limitations of the medium, I guess, is that you're not privy to a lot of the, nonverbal cues and things that you would get in a more traditional type of social interaction. So, somebody is talking, they say something, and, they mean it in more of a just kind of a venting kind of way, let's say. But this actually happened with an athlete of mine. We were communicating via text just like a week ago, and he was telling me he had a bad training session to cap off kind of a bad training cycle. Things weren't going well, and he was pissed. Totally valid way to feel, and he was venting about it and kind of complaining about. And I don't mean complaining in like a derogatory sense, but just like he's complaining about the program and things that didn't work. And you've got to do that to some extent. But the way that it's not just the way that he said it, it's that I'm reading it on the other end, and I have my own mentality and emotional baggage and whatever else comes up. And I didn't hear it in the way that he meant it, so I took it a little bit more personally than I should have. And I, fired something back that, and it wasn't crazy. It wasn't super out of hand or anything. But, when he responded to my response, then it clicked. I was like, oh, he's venting. And I didn't meet him where he was in that venting, and I also can't help to think, like, if I'm doing that to somebody that I know a lot better than the average person that you follow on social media, how often does that happen to people that comment on a video that I make or something like that? And I'm sure that happens much more with you. My stuff tends to be a little bit more matter of fact. We can discuss the yeses and nos, but there's a lot of in between, but we can talk about that stuff and hopefully get closer to, I guess the shared reality. But in your case, you're talking more about the experience, and that's, it's much more difficult to talk about, first of all, and it's more difficult to nail it down, and it's going to, you've got to be in the right, I think you've got to be in the right mental or emotional state to hear it. So, I mean, I would just think that there's a lot of difficulty in communicating about a topic like that. Yeah.
And I sit down and I write my captions, actively thinking, how is this gonna be approached? How is this gonna be accepted as well as possible by 92,000 people? So you can hear the absurdity of it, but it's I try. But it's very interesting when you have a problem. The first reaction most people have is they want to fix it. That is like human nature. So okay, so you're sad. No, don't be sad. think like this instead. And it's like, okay, but I don't know. I find it fascinating. I do it myself so much, and I always try to stop myself. But still, I do it repeatedly to people who just want to be validated.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I think there's a component of human nature there. Like, and it can be something like that, like feeling one way or another. It could be, hey, my training cycle's not going as well as it should. Well, hey, have you tried doing this or that? It's like, well, I mean, not to sound arrogant or anything, but at least in my case, I'm a bit skeptical of answers that just show up in front of me in a comment on YouTube or something like that. Not to say that I don't know. This is sounding a bit overly negative. I think I'm not discouraging that sort of thing, but just I think it's important to think about how your message is going to be received, and maybe that's a personality trait in its own right. I tend to be a bit more of an introvert, and I don't recall offhand. I know that we did Big Five testing when you first started up, but I don't recall offhand how you rated.
I'm like extremely high on extroversion.
I mean, it makes sense. So I wonder where that tendency to introspect on things. I wonder where that lies, because I don't think it's extroversion. And it may not be a Big Five parameter. It may be an aspect of our personality that lies outside the Big Five test. I mean, that's possible, likely even. So anyway, that's.
I don't remember my results exactly, but I think very high on extroversion and very high on openness.
I think you're right now. Now that you mention it, I think you were high on everything except neuroticism, if I'm remembering correctly.
I think, or no, like extremely low on the thing that I can't pronounce.
Conscientiousness.
Thanks.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I should just look it up.
Yeah.
But anyway, I wanted to ask you as well about. So we've talked a lot about mentality and how it's shaped over the years, and how you approach things now. How does your mentality shift or change as you get closer to a competition? Like, you've got Worlds coming up, and if my estimates are correct, this podcast will post, a week or 2 weeks before the World Championship. So how does the approach of a major competition affect the way that you're living your life, I guess? Not to be too open-ended about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question also, but I think in one way, Worlds for me is like a overhanging threat. Like it's an ominous thing in the future that is approaching at a very fast pace, and I guess I just start to. Man, I feel like my vocabulary isn't enough to cover everything in English, but I know you've seen my training lately, and you've seen my message bombing that I sent to you. This is what's happening right now. Now this happened right now. Okay, 10 minutes later, something new happened. Gotta talk about it. So everything is just getting more and more intense in my head, and like every session is just the input is getting bigger from my side. Like I'm leveling up, and just by doing that, I'm exhausting myself more. And I can see myself getting the results, but I can also see myself like, you're running towards the finish line and you're running faster and faster and faster. And I can I visualize being on the other side and just being done. I want to be done.
Yeah.
But everything, these cycles that I do before a big meet are really interesting, because that's where I get all the juice in my head, like all the food for thought. This is the essence of it. This period of time. So I still don't love preparing for a big meet, but I can more and more clearly see myself getting these puzzle pieces from preparing for it that are invaluable, and I just can't get it in any other way, so to speak.
Yeah, I can relate to that. That, speaking for myself, approaching a big competition was always uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I started looking forward to it being over as it approached.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like the closer it got, the more intense that feeling became. Like in the beginning, you know, you're 3 weeks out or something, and you know, I remember just feeling like, you know, I have these ideas about training and things like that, and I really want to go back to that and focus on that for a little while. And then as the competition approached, you know, it's like it was a louder and louder stimulus, you know.
Yeah.
And I noticed as time went on, like as I got, you know, further along in my competitive career, that, you know, just like I would have like short-term mood changes as like, especially in the, you know, 3 to 4 day out time frame, you know, it would get to where it was noticeable to me, you know, that comments that people would make, I would find more irritating than usual, you know.
Yep.
I was more easily annoyed, and you know, I remember thinking about it, and it's funny how the things that shape you, right?
Yeah.
I can remember back to an early competition that I had when I was in college, and there was this other kid who was competing. He was also in college, and his dad was handling him. You know, so he's there backstage with his dad, and you know, he's there. He's got his headphones on. He's getting psyched up, and um, how did this go? Like he goes to get up out of his chair or something like that, and like the cord on the headphones tugged a little bit, and so this was back in the CD player days. His dad's holding a CD player, so he gets up out of his chair, and the cord on the headphones tugs a little bit, and he takes the cord and he jerks the CD player out of his dad's hand. And I remember thinking, like, what an asshole. And now that's maybe not a fair assessment of him because he's obviously going through a lot right then. But I remember thinking, like, I don't want to treat people that I care about that way, you know,
Yeah.
like for competition, for any reason. Like, I just don't want to do that, you know. And so, like, I noticed that as I would get closer to competitions, this was years later, I noticed, hey, I get more irritable. I get, you know, like you're dealing with this thing and you don't even realize that or at least I didn't even realize that it was the stress of competing that was making me respond in this way, you know. But I was talking to a friend of mine and he's like, well, you know, it kind of makes sense, you know, what you're talking about. Comments get more irritable. Like that's like, if you think about the stress response, the human stress response, and your senses become more sensitive and things like that, like hey, it makes sense that, you know, bright lights are going to seem brighter, loud noises are going to seem louder, annoying people are going to seem more annoying, you know.
Yeah.
So and being able to frame it in that way, I guess being able to put a label on it allowed me to deal with it a lot more directly, you know. And I mean, even if it was just to apologize for things that I did that, you know, I regretted later on or something like that, you know. So that was an important observation for me in my, you know, I guess psychological development.
Should make a T-shirt that says "Sorry for the things I said when I was preparing for Worlds."
just just wear it.
Yeah.
Just because.
Yeah.
No further explanation.
Yeah. I was prepping for the European Championships last year, and I was feeling worn out and anxious, and I didn't grasp that. Like, I didn't understand why, even though it should be clear as day, but I didn't. And my friend in training was like, "Do you know what date it is?" I'm like, yeah, it's this time of year. Why? He's like, "Do you remember the exact date last year when you were preparing for the European Championships?" I'm like, yeah. Yeah, I said the same thing, didn't I? He was like, yes, the exact same words. You used the same sentence. It just keeps repeating itself.
Yeah, that's funny.
It's a good thing to be aware of. You can check yourself, definitely.
Yeah, of course.
But I have to say that emerging strategies has changed a lot for me. The way of training that means.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think I used to get a lot more anxious because of the way I started thinking about the weights before the session, knowing that this session is coming up and the weights are going to be heavier than they were last week. I'm doing triples now instead of fours, and like building up a lot of anxiety around the increased intensity. And just going to the session, doing the same thing as last week and just adjusting to RPE instead, it's been like game changing, to be honest. It's been very good for me.
Wow, that's cool to hear.
Yeah.
So and we've definitely done podcasts and presentations on emerging strategies. So if anybody doesn't have the background on that, I'm going to let them kind of fill themselves in on things like that. But so you're referring mostly to the fact that it's the same training week repeated. In your case, I believe it's like 7 weeks. If we're doing a normal training frequency, it's like a 7-week time to peak. So it's the same training week for the last 6 or 7 weeks leading into a major competition.
Yeah.
So that does give you a chance to settle in. The weights go up, but they're incrementally up. It's not massive jumps in intensity as you get closer. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know going to the session that I'm likely going to be stronger this week, but I don't have to be stronger, or I don't have to add weight if I don't feel like I should. And like I can read my own signs very well. So I know that last week I went for this weight and it worked well. I didn't blow RPE, but it messed with me so much mentally that I need to back off a little bit this week. And I did. And the week after that, I just had the best session ever. And, I can adjust myself emotionally to the weights in a very flexible way. It's been making a lot of difference for me. So I can go to the session with almost like a bit of a childish curiosity, like what's going to happen today? I don't know. Something good, probably.
That's awesome. That's a great sentence just by itself. But I really like that approach, and it goes back to the thing that we said in the beginning about the mental being connected to the physical.
Mm-hmm.
That if I've talked to coaches before who say that they've got a session planned with 5 exercises. If the athlete hits a big PR in the first exercise, they send them home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's debatable whether or not that in itself is the right strategy. But the point is that they're taking into account the mental state and the effects, the after effects of that kind of performance. And what I hear you saying is something not all that different. Last week I had a really big session and it was very taxing psychologically. And that can bleed over into, the next session and so on. So by kind of voluntarily pulling back the throttle a little bit, it keeps you in control, which is nice. It gives you a little bit of extra time to adapt to the stimulus. And I mean, we're not talking about wild swings here either. It's not like, well, I'll just not train this week or this, only use 50% or something like that. It's minor adjustments to the loading. And especially if we're talking about psychological stress, a little bit of adjustment to the loading can make all the difference.
Yeah. And just like for the listeners who don't follow my training in detail, the example that I'm referring to was like, okay, so week 1, this is after the Arnold's, I've just squatted 200. It was like my biggest dream of powerlifting was to accomplish that, and somehow I did it, and I'm just like landing in that feeling. And then I'm going back to training and I'm realizing that I can do it again. It wasn't like I can do this in training now. So I went for 200 and it was easy and extremely mentally taxing to like process that the fact that I'm squatting 200 suddenly the week, like just a few weeks later in training. And that's understandable. It's a reasonable feeling that, wow, this is going really fast now. And so next week I just went for 195, and that's just 5 kilos. It doesn't make a huge difference, like training wise. The intensity is still high. But for me to it's not 200. It's fine. You can back off. And that was I just felt very liberated. And the week after I went for 202.
Yeah, and just to be able to adjust based on that the pull, whatever. I don't know. That's not a very specific description at all. But to be able to adjust on the fly like that, I think is good. And of course, I mean, I think it goes without saying that some people are going to be better at that and more in touch with those types of signals than other people. But it is something that I think you get better at with practice. If you're paying attention, that is the biggest thing. That I went to dinner with some people that I met on the internet a couple days ago, I guess. I took a trip. I was down in Texas, and anyway, long story short, I ended up at dinner with some other lifters, and one of them asked me, what's the thing that I feel like is most important to being a good coach? And immediately I said, paying attention, because that's the thing that I think trumps everything else. If you know everything that there is to know about training, but if you can't pay attention to the athlete, then it doesn't mean anything, and I think the same thing goes for athletes too. This ties back to the introspection thing that we were talking about earlier. If you can just think to yourself, at some level, like, yeah, I was feeling like this today. I wonder why I was feeling like that. And just kind of play with it a little bit and figure it out. Look at it like a puzzle, and gradually you start to be able to pay attention to those signals. I think you're a great example. When I was getting into the sport and you would talk to advanced lifters, one thing that they would often say is like how important it is for you to learn to listen to your body. Listen to your body. That's what you've got to do. You go, okay, well, how do I do that? And they'd say, well, it takes you 10 years to figure it out. And that was basically it, not super helpful. But a lot of the tools that I've worked on in the time since have been trying to teach how to do that in a more step-by-step way, I guess. Mm-hmm. But really what you're talking about is having that intuitive sense of this is what I need right now, and trusting that sense. And you've developed this much earlier than the 10-year mark. So I think that's very cool. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot to be learned from that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, coming back to not just having the number approach, the percentage approach, and like most optimal programming approach. If you can leave that aside for a minute and just, this is going to sound so incredibly cliche that I'm embarrassed, but listen to your heart. Like, listen to yourself. What am I there for? What am I doing today? Like all those aspects of me in that room, because I'm at this level because I can push myself very hard. Obviously I wouldn't be here if I didn't have that ability. So being sensitive to that ability and knowing how to use it's critical, because I would break either mentally or physically if I didn't know how to just be in tune with how to use my like this relentless ability to force myself through these situations that we have with the bar.
Yeah. Well, this may throw us completely onto another topic, but I think a lot of it goes back to purpose. You also have a very well articulated purpose for why you're doing what you're doing. And that's a huge part, I think, of finding what it is that motivates you. Speaking for myself, I didn't have an articulated purpose until it's more recent than I'd care to admit, probably. But like people talk about that, like why are you here? Why are you doing this? And I've talked to lifters, some of my lifters, about their purpose for training, and it's not easy to figure out. It's not easy to articulate. And I think the fact that you're motivated to train, anybody is motivated to train, means that there is a purpose there. So just because you can't articulate it right now doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's
Yeah.
there. It's this process of self-discovery that we're talking about. That's how you have to go about figuring it out. You kind of peel back the layers on it a little bit, and you figure out what this purpose is with time.
Yeah. It's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Can I ask you what that purpose is for you, or is it a private thing?
No, I'm perfectly happy to share. So, for now, at least, because these things are always open-ended, it seems to me that my purpose behind lifting weights is to figure it out, I guess.
Mhm.
But it's something like improvement. The big thing that helped me to figure this out was when I decided to take a step back from competing. I knew that squatting and deadlifting hurt. I was tired of doing things that hurt all the time. So I was going to stop doing that. I'm going to take the advice that I give to all my athletes: stop doing things that hurt.
It's
And
reasonable.
yeah, I mean, so okay, that means no competing in powerlifting for a while. So what am I going to do with myself? Well, I'm going to find a couple exercises that I can do, and I'm going to treat those like the competition lifts. So for me, I could do front squats as much as I want and have no issues at all. So, okay, front squats one. And then the other one, I bounced around between a few, but for now, it's pull-ups. So right now, uh, in my head, I'm still a power lifter, but my competitive exercises are front squat, bench press, and pull-ups. So it's a bit of a different approach. And once I decided that, it was like an instant switch. That was just what I cared about, and my training was built to optimize front squatting now. And, I trained that as if it was a competition lift. I cared about it. When it would improve, I felt like when I'd hit a front squat PR, it mattered to me. Um, and now, like, I've got this weird thing, like I want to get to a 600-pound front squat, and like no one else on the planet cares about this, but I do, you
Yeah.
know. So that's the thing for me, is it's like, it's the purpose. It's not powerlifting itself. Powerlifting was a vehicle for that for a while, but now it seems like it's moved on. And it's something similar to why I care about business, why I care about coaching and tracking things. And it ties together a lot of the different neuroses, I guess, that I've got in my life, but that's kind of how it happened for me. So that would have been like 2015 or something, that I finally connected the dots on that. If you'd asked me before then, I probably would have said something else that turned out not to be it, or at least isn't it anymore.
Yeah. It's reasonable to change your purpose over time as you develop as a person as well. But
Yeah.
it sounds like you have like the optimal intrinsic motivation behind why you're in the gym.
Well, I guess it's different for everybody, and I kind of scoff at a little bit at the people who want to. I guess to me, it seems like focusing on the negative. Like I get, I feed off the haters. Like that type of mentality, which I don't know if that's just less common now, or if I've kind of curtailed my social circles a little bit. But like that never made any sense to me. But one thing that we've talked about a lot in this conversation is just how diverse motivating factors can be. And and it would be a bit hypocritical for me to write off stuff like that just out of hand.
Yeah, I was. I mean, this is very interesting because that's something I wanted to. It's something I had to accept with myself as well. I was preparing for. I was doing a talk at a fitness expo a few years back, and I wanted to share the presentation with my friend first. She's a psychologist, and she's written a thesis on in sports psychology on self-determination theory. So I was like, yeah, I want her feedback. And we talked about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And I think I was trying to angle it like I don't need the extrinsic motivation because I'm above it and I have all this intrinsic thoughts and feelings. And that was just not true because I'm driven by the fact that I want to prove myself and I want to show what I'm capable of. And I have that in me too, even though the other parts of me, like just the growth and the quest for understanding myself and all that stuff is big too. But I have both parts of it. And she was like, that's okay, you know?
Yeah.
And it's okay to strive for a goal that comes from extrinsic factors. And as you're in the process towards that goal, you're going to have all this intrinsic motivation that keeps you going towards it. And you'll learn from that and be motivated by that. And it all plays together. And then when you're on the other side of the goal, which is for me a meet, I wouldn't do a meet if there was no one watching. I wouldn't be there if I was the only person in the world, obviously. So for some reason, it's important to me because proving myself to all those people watching and getting the referees giving me white lights shows that I'm a person who's capable of working towards hard goals. So it's connected, and that's fine. And you don't have to like exclude something. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative for you.
Yeah, I mean,
you need to be aware of it and how to like shift focus from the two.
That sounds right on to me. You know, that like, look, we're social creatures, and the fact that you have some external motivators is probably normal and healthy. You know, that seems to make sense from where I sit. I mean, I probably wouldn't have been able to articulate it quite that way, you know, but that makes sense, you know.
Yeah, I think it's the problem arises when you don't understand everything that goes into the process towards the goal. Like when you're just focusing on the goal at all times and like the performance perspective, like the results, the actual goal in itself. So that's what I like to come back to, that when I'm done with something like a meet, for example, looking back and evaluating what happened towards it is the most important part of everything. So
yeah.
That's what I meant by what I said before, that I always win.
Exactly. It's not the not in the sense that people typically mean it. You know, it's in a deeper sense than that. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So shifting gears just a bit, and I'm probably getting ready to wrap because I know that I've taken up a lot of your time now. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the seminars that you do. I know that you've got a seminar coming up in New York on June 23rd.
Yeah, Squats and Science in Brooklyn.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Excellent. So can you tell us a little bit about what that's like? What kind of things do you talk about or cover? What's the experience like for somebody who attends one of your seminars?
Yeah, so what I want to share is a lot of the things that we talked about today, which is the approach that I have to training. And I really bring up a lot of my experiences during the times that it was really difficult in the beginning, like the performance anxiety that I had and how I worked past that. And that boils down to all the practical implementation of the mental strategies that I've used, like the actual use of imagery and self-talk and goal setting and this process thing that I talked about just now, and how I work with that and how I just practically do it every day. Give people the insight behind that and how they can implement it themselves. Everything from the broad approach to the practical techniques, like working with cues, for example, and visualizing and things like that. And my mental strategies is in the essence of it. And then the interesting part this time is that we will have Jim there, obviously, and he will be going over more the practical side of my actual training.
Yeah. I have spoken with him a bit about that. That's going to be a really cool thing.
Yeah.
I guess for those people who are interested in kind of a nuts and bolts type of approach as well. But I like that you get to spend an entire seminar on the mental side. It's much more than the paying lip service to it that a lot of us do. There are many more articles written on how many sets and reps should I do than there are on mental approaches to the sport. Although, if you were to rank the order of importance, then it would probably be the reverse.
Yeah,
but that's really cool.
It struck me when I held my first seminar in Liverpool, and what I usually do is I ask people to, like, I do a round before, and I ask people what their expectations are and like what they're interested in hearing about, just to give me an idea of it. And almost everybody says that they want to learn how to be less afraid of the squat, because I think just people really struggle, and there are some ways to work with it practically that are really, really helpful. That you can do in your own way. You definitely don't have to do it my way, but the strategies help you solve those mental problems in your own way with your personality.
Excellent. So if someone wanted to get registered for one of these seminars, how would they go about doing that?
Squats and Science are going to set up a website for that. It's going to be very easy to sign up. I think they'll be posting the link any day now.
Okay. So I'm sure it'll be posted by the time this podcast posts. Hopefully there will be some spots available for people who maybe are only just now learning about it. But if not, I'm sure you're doing a lot of these days. So maybe they can catch you in one of the other venues that you're covering. Where could I go to find out where else you would be giving seminars?
That is also going live pretty soon. My fabulous website, www.ivweissenberg.com. It's going to be also very easy to sign up for everything. I'll have the events calendar on there. It's
excellent.
Coming in a day soon. And just don't want to leave out that the seminar is obviously also including training, like a training session with one-on-one coaching and individualized help with technique and feedback on all the lifts.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Very cool. Very cool. Well, hopefully I can make it out to one of these as well sometime soon. It may be a little bit, as we heard earlier, my daughter is still quite small, but at some point that will settle down and hopefully I can make it out to one of these as well. But thanks so much for being generous with your time today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and your experiences and whatnot. This was a really, really cool conversation, really unique, and I hope that people listening are able to take something useful from it, more than, hey, what exercises should I do? That it's this goes as deep as you want it to go, right?
Yeah.
Very, very good, very good. Well, thanks again for being on, and everyone listening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Reactive training systems. Reactive training systems.